Thanks everybody for being here with us this morning today. I know that, again, I think I know as I was scrolling through the screen, most people, but we will still, I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Julie Payne-Kirchmeyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Vice President for Student Affairs. And this presentation and this series that's starting with this particular presentation is something that really came out of our conversations with all of you and your respective teams throughout the summer based on feedback we got from the staff survey. There were a lot of questions about budget. There was a lot of questions, and it was all across the spectrum about budget, whether it was how do we manage aligning the student affairs budget with priorities, up to how does the university approach it, or what are some of these basic budgeting concepts that we really should know so that we can understand how it impacts us. So we really wanted to respond to that, and so created this 3-part series. And this is the first part of the series, which is February. And then of course we have one in March and in April. And we are so thrilled and excited that Jake Julia is here with us, our Vice Provost for Administration and Chief of Staff in the Provost area. I've known Jake since I started. I think, Jake, you were like one of the first people I met when I came to campus, when you were really working over with the Office of what was formerly known as Change Management. You've been here since 1996, correct?
That is correct.
Yep.
Yes.
So Jake knows Northwestern. He is all too familiar with, I think, our budgeting process, but he also teaches a course in our Master of Science in Higher Education program about this subject. And so we thought, what a great person to come in and help us walk through the higher level concepts around budgeting. And I also hear from his students that he does this very well, but it also takes him a full quarter. So we're getting, I think, a compressed version, something that's a little bit more tailored potentially to what we may need. Yeah. So Jake, I'm so grateful that you're here. Great. And before I turn it over to you, folks, you do have the ability, this is a general Zoom, okay? So we will be monitoring questions in the chat. And so ask them as we go throughout, and there'll be moments where I may break in and ask Jake a question if we start to see some themes come up. Ronnie and Regan and Leslie Ann, thank you to the 3 of you. They are doing, as we all have come to know and love, the mission control work behind the scenes to make sure that those questions are tracked and we can get them in front of Jake and those themes. We can also tell you that any questions that we don't get to today, like we have done in all of our sessions, we will get those back to the people who ask them after the fact, so that, you know, Ronnie is tracking every question that's asked. We just want to make sure that everybody is heard and that we can get you the answers that you need. In addition to asking questions throughout, we will have some time at the end for just a general Q&A. So I'll pop back on and help moderate that. But hopefully with the content and through your questions, we can really get some good information here today. So with that, Jake, I will turn this over to you and look forward to learning with and from you.
Fantastic, Julie. Thank you. Thank you so much. I just appreciate the opportunity to talk with this group and to give you some ideas related to kind of how a budget works and what it does, and maybe answer some questions you have. Again, I was, as Julie did, just encourage you as we go through to ask questions. And if I don't know the answer, I will just tell you. When Julie and Leslie Ann and others kind of asked if I might be interested, I said, of course, because this is just a really fun for me. But the title is Budget Series 101. And so what I'm going to do is talk about some pretty fundamental concepts. And so for some of you, I noticed that Sheila Driscoll was on the line, who was formerly in the budget office, and Lori Garden. I don't know if she's on or not, but they could probably give this presentation. I just want to be really clear. So if I guess you can check your emails or look at something if I'm getting too fundamental. But I hope this will be helpful. And again, I want to strongly encourage you to ask questions as we go forward. So with that, let's Anthony. Yep. Great. So just really quickly, again, I'd like to just give an overview of budgets. I mean, in essence, what is a budget? Kind of talk through some of the methodologies and types of budgets. Go over revenues and expenses and some of their implications. Connect on a few budget terms. And then I would like to spend a few minutes just on Northwestern University's resource planning or its budgeting process, just to give you a flavor of how that works, what we do. Again, I want us to engage, and so I look forward to. I'm going to jump right in and again, as I do go through, fire away. So next slide, please. So what's a budget? Well, I mean, at its first and foremost, it is just a financial representation of institutions' plan. I think sometimes there's a tendency to, oh, it's the budget, and oh, it's this sort of great golden oracle out there. And in fact, it really is simply, how do we track what we need to spend on the activities that we do as an institution, and how do we fund them? And the budget itself really provides sort of an update on the financial status of the university. At the end of a cycle, usually it's a year, a budget cycle, and it's something that our trustees have two primary responsibilities. They have a responsibility to hire, and let's just say hire the president, and fiduciary responsibility. And so the budget helps them to ensure that we are doing what we should in terms of matching our revenues and sources of revenue to our expenses as an institution, and doing that in an accountable way. And I guess I would say a lot of times we're all engaged in planning, and we talk about strategic planning and the need to plan, and we spend a huge amount of time and effort on it. And my really strong sense, and I've said this to many folks, is planning without the resources or budget behind it is just hope. And so, really the importance of a budget is to make sure that when we plan as an institution, and then as we execute, that we have the resources to be able to do that. And it's not much more than that. Has very different roles in an institution, though. So next, if we could go to the next slide, please. So it really is a mechanism for setting priorities. Again, you can call something a priority, but if you don't fund it, it really isn't. And I think that if you look at a budget, you look overall at the university's budget, where we are expending our resources, really sets our priorities. And so it is absolutely a way, sort of the actualization of where we think our priorities are at an institution at any one given time. And given that what I said earlier about planning, it's a plan of action. And so when you have resources, you can take the action, you can run programs, you can provide support for students, you can undertake professional development. These are all actions that we do in our daily work, and the budget sort of frame that. It's a contract, and I think this is really important. It's sort of a contract between the senior leadership of the university and the various operating units, so that we say you have a budget, then until we say otherwise, and unfortunately, as in the past several years, we have had to do that. It's a commitment that you can expend against this, these expenses that you have against revenues that we're providing as an institution. It's also a contract in that we get many of the sources of our revenue that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, come with restrictions. And so, for example, when we have federal financial aid, there are certain restrictions that come with that. When we have direct costs for the almost 900, actually over $900 million in research expenditures each year, the direct costs have restrictions. And so it's a contract to make sure that we meet those restrictions in how we expend the money. It's a control mechanism. And again, one could make the argument that it hasn't really hasn't fully worked at Northwestern over the past several years. And in fact, we've been spending quite a bit of time making sure we come back to that, where we ensure that our expenses don't extend beyond our revenues. And so when many of you have to go through quarterly projections, or those on your staff need to do that, this is part of that control mechanism to make sure that we're expending at the rate we thought. And if there are any changes that are coming in that in terms of that, or if there are environmental factors, a pandemic, for example, that we are, that we're making sure we control and modulate our expenditures. It's a gauge of institutional risk. So it's interesting. Julie mentioned, I've been here. It's almost in August. It'll be not but it'll be 25 years. It seems like a long time. That was my reference there. And I think there was a time when Northwestern was hugely conservative in terms of its investments, and really wanting to ensure that more than anything we had a balanced budget. There was a real pride in that, and there still is. But over the past several years, there was an idea that maybe we should be expending more and than we had in the past. And with that comes some risk. We did, we'll talk about capital budgeting in a few minutes. And, there was a period of time, over about the last 5 years, we spent over $2.5 billion on new academic and other buildings at the university. And so, taking that on and taking the debt on was more of a risk than we've done in the past. And you can kind of tell by the budget, where the budget came out, how we did on that. It is an instrument of communication. And again, it tells the community kind of what our priorities are, how we're expending on them, and and what we think in essence is important as an institution as we go forward. And then it is a political device, and whether it's conscious or informal or formal, there are negotiations that happen on an ongoing basis in terms of where our funding goes. Some of it depends on issues that arise. When President Shapiro decided that we wanted to make sure that we had 20% of our students as Pell Grant students by 2020, obviously, again, we were even better than that. There were a lot of negotiations that went on, again, whether they're formal or informal, to say, darn it, this is a priority, and we're going to, make some trade-offs to be able to do that. And so those trade-offs are kind of part of a political process that's inherent in every budget process. I'll take a breath for a second and just say that these are things that happen at the university level. They happen at the school and vice presidential level, and they happen at the unit level as well, where almost, whether it's daily or part of an overarching process, people, kind of say, can we make this trade-off, or are there ways that we can, get this done? And that really becomes a political process, basically. Next, please. So what are some budget methodologies? Again, these are terms you probably have heard, and I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on them, but incremental budgeting, really all that it means, and I guess we could say at Northwestern, perhaps we've done some decremental budgeting here in the past several years. It means that either you increment or you decrement your budget by a certain percentage. And so when we're going to talk about expenses in a few minutes, we're going to find that at a place like Northwestern, between 65 and 75% of all of our expenses are human resources. And so it might be that in an incremental budgeting process, we would basically say, okay, we're going to increment the salary pool for our faculty and staff by X% over the coming year. We may say that we're going to increment our non-personnel expenses by Y%. And you just basically build on the budget that's there. It's stable. It is reasonably easy for people to understand. And it basically means that in good times, you're building on the previous budget and just moving forward. Now, the challenges we've had here over the past several years, we have gone in the other way. Let me be very upfront with you, and we've decremented. And so, we were at, X, and then, over the past 2 years, X minus, Y% based on, the non-personnel expenses that were cut out of the budget. And frankly, as everyone is aware, and I want to be upfront, the personnel, the human resource increments have been taken out of the budget. So it does work both ways. But again, it's on an incremental basis either way when you look at it. Responsibility-centered management is called, you'll hear people call it RCM. You might hear people call it tubs on their own bottom. Basically, it means that there are, in this environment, your schools and administrative units, predominantly your schools actually, would be sort of having their own revenues and their own expenditures. So here at Northwestern, we have a hybrid model. So our undergraduate schools are what we call appropriated schools, meaning that they get an allocation from the central budget every year to fund their activities. Our professional schools, however, are in this RCB model, which means that the revenues come directly to those schools, and then they're responsible for matching their own expenses against those revenues on an ongoing basis. And so, for example, if there was a situation where Kellogg ended up going into deficit, Kellogg is responsible for meeting that deficit. It might mean that they have to take a loan from the university. which we would hope, again, this is not happening, just to be very clear. I know this is being recorded. I'm just using this as an example, but it really means that they are sort of their own sort of business units within the institution, and they pay a sort of a subvention fee to the university, for lack of a better term, to kind of cover, obviously the buildings and the land, the utilities are Northwestern. They're not the individual schools. And so the funding comes back to the central administration from those schools for that. Some schools have all of their units, all of their schools on this RCM model. I believe the University of Michigan, for example, is on that. In some ways, it makes each of the deans, their own sort of financial boss, basically, in that sense, and responsible for both their revenues and their expenses. The challenge is that when you have that, and Morty Shapiro is, I guess USC had this, and Morty came from USC 2 institutions ago. And one of the things that he outlined very clearly is that it really puts up a sense of competition between the units. So you might have, so Morty was president of the School of Arts and Sciences, or College of Arts and Sciences, not president, dean. And he used to joke because the business school would have its own English courses and its own art history courses, because they could get those faculty members cheaper than they could, by sort of paying the School of Arts and Sciences to have their English courses taken there. So we at Northwestern really believe that we want to be on this appropriated model for our sort of undergraduate schools, so that we don't run into those sorts of challenges. And our professional schools are run on this other, on RCB or RCM. I mentioned zero-based budgeting because it comes up a lot. Oh, somebody comes in and, you need a zero-based budget. And, it is something that you see sometimes when a new leader comes in, you want to zero-based, which basically means going back and not assuming increments. So you're going to go back and say, we're starting from scratch and making sure that every activity is justified in our unit, in our area, and that we know what it costs, and that we know what the revenues that are going to be applied to that. Takes a huge amount of time. And again, if you think about the fact that between 65 and 75% of the expenses in any given unit or in an organization are human resources, you have to be, if you're going to do zero-based budgeting, you really have to be willing to kind of look at the human resource expenses, and that's a challenge for a lot of folks. So it's out there. It tends to be used in really focused areas, and so if you're in a unit that it's kind of just incremented for a long period of time, it may be that your leader decides, let's go back to square one and see where we are. Really challenging, difficult to run at a whole institution, and rarely does it happen. If it does happen, sometimes it's more on the non-personnel expenses that it's done. Next,
Jake.
Yeah.
Real quickly, I'm trying to connect a couple of things here. When you talk about responsibility-centered budgeting and these budget methodologies, I know that within student affairs, we have a few different approaches given the different units that report up through us.
Yeah.
Would an appropriate comparison be that maybe our residential services area is funded more like, or our budget's more in that space versus the other areas within the Division of Student Affairs?
It is fair to say that. I think, when we get to the next slide, Julie, we're going to talk about sort of auxiliary budgets. And
there we go.
I think, in some ways it's a terminology issue, but yeah, absolutely. Those are, if you look at the sort of second sub-bullet there, things like the, like residential services, the bookstore, would be auxiliary enterprises that kind of have their own revenues and their own expenses. Absolutely. It's, I think, a little bit more targeted when we think about auxiliaries versus overall, but it's the same model.
Great, thank you.
Are there other questions? I will take a breath here. Is there anything else you'd like to answer at this point?
Not at this point. No, it doesn't look like it.
Okay, great, super. So, when we talk about budgets, a lot of times what people are talking about are operating budgets. And that's the day-to-day sort of expenses of the institution. At Northwestern, it's about $2.6 billion. It's comprised of restricted and unrestricted funds. So restricted funds are those, pretty much what they say. They're restricted use. So it would be, many times, gifts that come in have restrictions and how they can be spent and when they can be spent and by whom. I mentioned earlier, direct costs associated with federal grants are restricted. If we have state state appropriations. We don't have significant state appropriations, but the state does provide funding for some programs, and they would be restricted in terms of how we could use that. Unrestricted basically means that the funding can be used, obviously, in a legal and compliant way, but with a lot of flexibility. Maybe that's a better way to frame it. The other thing is a distinction that's good to make is recurring versus non-recurring. So recurring is something where we make an allocation and we understand that it's going to be part of the ongoing operating budget. So when you ask for a incremental FTE, full-time equivalent position, then generally it's probably going to be recurring unless you say, I only need this person for 1 year and I'm only going to fund it for 1 year. Non-recurring means that there is a time limit. Could be 1 year, it could be 3 years, but it's not going to be part of the permanent budget. It'll be part of the annual budget. It'll be in there for that year, but it won't be something that's going to be incremented every year going forward. Sometimes when people, again, maybe you've experienced this, but when people are proposing new full-time positions, they'll say, oh, I just want to do it on a non-recurring basis to try it. And I would just tell you, centrally, we're cautious about that because, things change, and if you're making a commitment to somebody to come here, unless you're really explicit with them that they're only going to be there for a year, or the commitment is only for a year or 2 years or whatever it might be, then we want to be careful about making about baiting and switching, in essence, somebody so that they don't come in with the expectation that they're going to be funded on an ongoing basis if they don't have that funding in place. So just something we run into. Restricted budgets are simply kind of sub budgets that we would use to make sure that we are compliant. It's that control mechanism I talked about a little bit earlier in terms of just ensuring that we are matching and meeting the restrictions that are there. We talked about auxiliary enterprise budgets already, and there are several within student affairs, and many of you are, several of you I know have those responsibilities of oversight in those areas. And then hospital operations, the clarity here is that we have affiliated hospitals. And I think I just point that out, that in some institutions, the hospital budget and the university's operating budget are connected and almost integrated. And here, our hospital operations and our affiliation forwards funding as a resource source for us, basically on an ongoing basis, based on our relationship, but it isn't, part of our budget. It's separate, basically. And then just service center budgets are within the, our budgets, like there are instrumentation, service corps, for example, in some of our schools, and they have their own budgets because, again, you might say they're an auxiliary or an RCM type model as well, where they're internally charging their budgets, and we just want to make sure we're tracking what's being expended there. And then, yeah, Lori, thank you for that comment. That absolutely endowments and gifts are very much, on the restricted funds that come in. Not always, and I think there's a lot of excitement when an unrestricted gift comes in, but many of them respecting and understanding that donors have very explicit, what areas where they want their expenditures to go through. And then capital budgets. Actually, if we flip to the next slide, please. So, capital budget, it basically is, we define a capital project as anything with a total project budget over $100,000. So if you've come from other institutions or you come from smaller institutions, it could be, in some institutions, they call capital anything over $5,000. I think it depends on the institution, the size of the budget, the complexity of the budget. And so here, and I won't read these sub bullets, but basically, this sorts of define when you think about a capital request, or you may be in a position where you want some construction done. This sort of gives an idea of some of the areas that that would be covered in a capital budget. Next slide, please.
Jake, we got a quick question from
sure.
someone in the chat wanting to know. Lori had brought up that a lot of our restricted budgets, are gifts and endowments.
Yeah.
But what are other examples of restricted budgets that are not gifts or endowments?
Yeah, so if we look right here in this slide, for example, the federal government, for every grant, that federally sponsored grant that the university receives, and again, it was $900 million worth of them last year, we have direct costs and we have indirect costs. So the direct costs basically are the human resources, the the cost of equipment, the lab renovation, those are explicit costs that are put into the grant and are funded and are restricted only for that. Absolutely only has to be that. The indirect costs, it's called the F&A, Finance and Administration Rate, or indirect cost recovery. And it's a percentage of each of our, that comes in with each grant. It's kind of an overhead. And while the idea appropriately is that since it costs way more to do research than the grants actually will cover, that the indirect costs can be used for unrestrictedly. So you can use them in any way. It comes to kind of the bottom line. But the direct costs would be, I think, a really good example. The other thing would be for the state. So again, we talk about state grants. If the state is funding a specific program, we've put in proposals recently for some capital projects that would be funded by the state of Illinois. If they fund it, we can't just sort of take that money and apply it somewhere else. We have to use it for a specific project that we define. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. And yeah, Northwestern does have a standard indirect cost. I believe right now it is 60%. Please don't quote me, and I can find out. It's either 58 or 60%. So for every grant that you figure your direct costs and then add 60% on top of that for the indirect costs. We have a great team here, by the way, in financial services. It's a really tough negotiation with the federal government to get that rate. And so one side note here is that we spent, I mentioned the $2.5 billion that we spent in buildings over the past, probably 5 to 7 years. Many of those buildings, not all certainly, were research buildings. And because of the fact that we are expending all of those institutional resources on that research, it helped us in our case to increase our indirect cost rate. Again, if we think overall about the revenues coming into the institution, to Northwestern, we have tuition and fees, and just an understanding. Yep, thanks, Lori. I thought so. Good. That obviously tuition and fees, and that's the institutional financial aid that we give to students would come off the top of those fees. Mentioned the federal grants, state grants, and again, just to be clear, if we were at Indiana, mentioned earlier, Michigan, Wisconsin, this money coming in from the state would be much higher than it is as a private institution like Western. Next slide, please. So we mentioned again that the private gifts and grants are a source of revenue. Again, Northwestern has a $5.1 billion raised over the last number of years, and again, those comes from very generous donors. And again, I know Student Affairs has been the recipient of many of those. For some corporate gifts, there are direct and indirect costs, but rarely they're not. Let me be explicit, at the same rate as the federal rate. And in many cases, the university makes a decision that depending on the amount of the corporate or foundation would be a better way to say it, gift. It may be that we would take a lower rate of that because we feel it's really important to receive it. So the indirect rate I was talking about earlier is predominantly for the federal major agencies. In terms of endowment, again, there is the research and the revenue comes in predominantly for the operational use from a payout that happens on an annual basis. It's generally around 5% here at Northwestern. The idea with the endowment, there's a lot of confusion out there right now, is that that it's something that helps Northwestern keep going in perpetuity. The university's been around for 165 years, and the idea is that we will be around for another 165 years at least. The endowment is what helps to do that. So the desire, I think maybe you all saw Amy Falls from Rockefeller University is joining the university shortly to be our chief investment officer. And her role in that is to make sure that she does everything possible to grow that endowment for the future use of the institution, and the connection with our operating budget is on an annual basis. Again, approximately 5% is paid off of whatever the endowment is at the time to help fund our operating or day-to-day expenses of the institution. So again, for clarity's sake, it may be that an annual year that the university makes 9% on those investments. And so, the 5% payout would come, out of that, but the rest would be reinvested to help build the capital and to move it forward. On special occasions, and this is, I believe, public knowledge that, given some of our financial constraints over the past several years, we did take some of the money out of the endowment to be able to make sure that we could continue, operating the university at the level that we wanted to. As a rarity, very, very rare, and not something that is advised. And then other revenues, again, many of you folks in student affairs would be aware of the sales, the revenue that comes from, obviously, from room and board, from dining services, from the bookstore, from medical services, and to the institution. And then really important source of revenue is at the bottom of the page, and it's licenses. So our faculty, on an ongoing basis, their research ends up with some really neat inventions, and there are royalties paid on that. And so the Lyrica Fund is like Northwestern's, major sort of success in that area, in which there were significant amount of funds that came in to the university. Some of it goes to the inventor. In this case, it was Rick Silverman. Some of it goes to the department, some to the school, and then some to the university to be able to use to help support its operations. And so again, we're not here to have our faculty be making inventions that make money, but when they do, there's a revenue stream that comes in from that, and so we take advantage of that and go forward. Next, please. How are we doing? Okay. On the expense side, again, I mentioned really briefly earlier, their human resource expense, salary and benefits. We just want to be clear about that. There are the day-to-day operations of the university, sort of what it takes to run. It's the programs you offer, it's the support that you provide students, it's the professional development that you undergo, it's the supplies you need on an ongoing basis to do your job, the computers, the technologies that you need. Those would be sort of operational and programmatic. We have what's called O&M. I use that because you may see the term. It's just what it takes to run the university's physical plant on a day-to-day basis. We mentioned earlier capital, that there are expenses related to the ongoing, beyond operations and maintenance. There's deferred maintenance, where we need to replace roofs, we need to replace floors, we need to put in new plumbing. There are those expenses that are kind of deferred maintenance on these buildings that we have, and then there are the new buildings and the major renovations that we have. And then Northwestern takes out debt to be able to make sure that it has appropriate cash flow to meet its bills on an ongoing basis, and to be able to not have to wait until we've saved up every penny to start a major project. And so obviously we pay interest on that debt, and that's an expense as well. And there are a few others that are associated, again, maybe explicitly with research in some of the other areas that I won't spend a lot of time on right now. Next, please. I think that these slides, I won't go over explicitly, because they really just, I think, reinforce some of the things that I've been talking about previously. So let's move on. Let's keep going. Next. Keep going. All right, thanks. So really, we're getting toward the end of the time, and I want to make sure there's time for more questions. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Northwestern's resource planning process. So these are the very, very clearly stated, what I would say, high-level priority goals. And so it is to strengthen faculty and staff compensation pool. To the degree possible means that exactly that. I can assure you that Kathleen Haggerty and Craig Johnson and Julie Payne-Kirchmeyer and Morty Shapiro are doing everything possible to make sure that we are maximizing whatever we can do for the faculty and staff compensation pool. We're very aware of the constraints we've run over the last 2 years, at least 2 years, and this is the highest priority. My caveat is just that, even with that sort of focus and desire and that high priority, I think it will be hard to meet everyone's expectations across the whole university, but we're going to do the very best we can to make sure that it is a robust compensation pool. Then to make sure that we are supporting our basic infrastructure, targeted investments in terms of our facilities and information technology, and then unequivocally and absolutely. And I would say that the compensation is at the top, certainly, but our, co at the top is maintaining the health and safety of our community, both through the pandemic and beyond. And so looking at how we invest in that as we move forward. Next slide, please. So what's the goal of our process? To provide as much transparency as possible as we go through the process, that we understand demonstrate the financial impact of the decisions that are being made. Came back to kind of where we started in terms of the budget being, sort of the implementation of the university's plans, and then identifying necessary trade-offs. And, that's, a really key point that I guess I would want to get across. We have an amazing, complex, exciting, diverse university at Northwestern, and our peers would be the same. So we're not unique, and we would like, I can share with you, let me not say we, I would love to be able to fund every great idea that comes in and every need that we have, and to the absolute maximum that we can. There are just a finite amount of resources that are available at any one given time. We do have to make trade-offs. We do have to make decisions. We try to make them as informed as possible as we look across the university. You have a vice president who's a hugely strong advocate for all things student affairs and everything in terms of our student support. And we do our best to take that into consideration as we think about these trade-offs, but it is part of the job. And frankly, I'll just share with you, it's one of the most challenging part of the job, because we do have to make very difficult decisions, and we respect and understand that it's not to everyone's satisfaction, actually never to everyone's satisfaction in terms of that. So again, we developed the framework. It's incremented, coming back to the incremental budget process from our FY21 budget. We refined it during the winter and spring quarters. And then we could spend, maybe it's budget 501, talking about GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. It's what the board needs in terms of kind of looking at our overall financial picture, and that's just what that means. Next slide. Yes, just again, so we have a number of meetings, in the fall where we talk about areas of priority and how they fit into the overall budget planning. All the schools and vice president units present their strategy and their funding options to the university leadership for consideration. And then there is that consideration, and then basically in May, June, we roll out what the decisions are for next year. Fiscal year, I didn't even mention that, and I should, here at Northwestern is September 1st to August 31st. So FY22 starts September 1st, 19, yeah, that's awful, 2021, sorry. Next slide.
It's okay, Jake, I think sometimes we all want to go back to 19, it's fine.
And this is another one that, just so you have, for people who are interested, I won't go into the details here, but I just wanted, we get questions, how do you make the decisions on those capital resources, those projects over $100,000? And this, I think, just defines that. Maybe this is something, if you had questions after the fact, I'd be glad to go through them, but don't want to get into too much detail now. Next slide, please. Yeah, questions. But actually, could you go to the next slide and then I'll come back to questions? Yeah, so I just want to be really clear, two things. One is that the Goldstein book is really one that I go back to even now, just to make sure that I'm clear on some of the concepts. And so if you really, you're excited, I've just generated so much excitement in you that you want to go out and know more about budgeting, it's a really good source. And then I do want to make sure that several of the slides here are ones that I use that were actually done by these colleagues, and just want to make sure that I cite them, because I didn't want to rework great work that was already done. So please know that. So if you could go back up to the question slide. Great. So what didn't I answer, or what more questions did I generate? Please fire away.
We've got a couple that were submitted ahead of time or during the process. Yeah. And then we can open it up to the larger group. One of the questions that we'd love to put in front of you, Jake, is that we know from the financial update that was sent out at the beginning of the calendar year that Northwestern experienced an I guess we call it an unplanned surplus for
Yeah.
FY20.
Yep.
And that the president said those dollars are being used for 21. Could you share with us like what that was used for? And then, how are surpluses typically used? Because I know this is sort of an atypical year.
Yeah. So no, thank you. So what I would say is that, just to be clear, the surprise was that we've never gone through a pandemic before, and we tried to be as conservative as possible so that we didn't put the university into a very negative financial situation as a result of the pandemic. And really what turned out happening was that we learned even more than we thought we knew about how much the university spends in travel and in events and in sort of professional development, going to conferences, presenting at conferences, by traveling there. And then with many people, I know many are, but with many people across the university not on campus, that's those sort of operations and maintenance expenses, the turning on the lights, things like that, really were way less than we anticipated in the end. So we ended up with the surplus. What we've done with that is, immediately sort of, and I have to be careful. What I would say is what it allowed us to do. So I don't want to be that we use that exact funding for these exact things, but what this allowed us to do was to go back and go back to the previous match for retirement, so that we could keep our commitment and not go forward, further without having that match. It allows us to pay for the extensive and expense for testing as we go through. This allows us to help with our technologies, especially our learning technologies, to make sure that, again, the experience of our students is as much as possible. It helps us to fund things like quarantine and isolation and the things that come along with that as well. So we are watching what happens this year. It's a very fair question to say, well, is this going to happen again? And our desire would be that we would match our revenues and expenses much more closely going forward. Julie, to your question about what happens in a regular year, it would be that when we have those surpluses, it allows us and sort of gives us the capital to be able to undertake sort of major projects that we might not be able to with our general operating budget. That we have a surplus that kind of backs up, the need to undertake a major new initiative or a major new capital project. And that's really what we have been doing in the past.
Great.
And we hope to get back to that, by the way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Jake. I think it just helps to hear it explained a little bit more than simply in a couple of lines in a letter. And I know that caused some questions.
Sure.
Another question that we got submitted, and this is from Kim. Thank you, Kim. You talked a little bit about, federal and state funding before, but, as a private institution in general, what kinds of federal and state funding do we receive? And do we think it's going to change because of COVID?
Yeah, so the predominant federal funding that we receive is through our, the major funding agencies for funded research, funded research. So I don't mean to leave anything out, but NIH, NSF, NEH, those sorts of agencies. That's predominantly for us where it comes through. Sometimes we have specific projects that really the state feels adds to the economy here, and they provide funding, for predominantly capital funds. In the past, we've had some matching funds, from state aid, to help bolster our some of our student aid. I don't know that we, given the status of the Illinois budget, that's actually something that we're still experiencing, but that might be an example. Versus a place like Michigan or Indiana or Wisconsin would get an appropriation from the state every year to help run its operations. So that would be that's a little bit of the difference, I would say.
Great. I think too, one of the things that we might want to put in the room is that we know that there was discussion in the summer, the CARES funding that came out for students.
Yeah.
Northwestern did not accept the funds last year.
Yeah.
In part because there were some pretty, what I would call draconian restrictions associated with it, and it would have hurt some of our students. Right. But a few of them actually. But there's some discussion about it this year, correct?
There is, and I think again, as we're going on, I think this is a different appropriation this year at this point than it was last year. The caveat is just because things change almost on a daily basis, and so I don't want to say something that tomorrow I find out is not true.
Right.
But yeah, and so what we just want to be really careful as an institution that we are aware of all of the the factors that are engaged in this. I mean, the same thing would extend with gifts. It's sometimes people have a challenge, and I understand that. Well, somebody told me that this donor was going to give $5 million. Why didn't you accept it? Let's see, probably 3 presidents ago, Arnold Weber was famous for talking about gifts that eat. And what he meant was that sometimes you take a gift, but it costs you more to implement the gift than it does to actually what the gift covers. And so we're careful on that as well to make sure before we say, yes, this is great, thank you, that we know what the implications are of the gift, so that we don't cause more than expense, for example, than what the gift does. So that would be another one.
Right. You mentioned like flexibility or some of these urgent things. We had a question come into the chat about what flexibility exists in the budget for emergent issues that may arise. So for instance, matters that are identified as, important by students and then maybe acknowledged by staff. So in our case, we hear that a lot with CAPS. Yeah. We hear it sometimes with HPAW and with some other needs.
So there's, I think, inevitably in a $2.6 billion budget, I think that there are opportunities to reallocate or to kind of utilize sort of what I would carry forward or surplus funds, basically. Now, again, I would say that in the past couple of years, we've also been cautious about using our carry forward funds because there are implications to that gap accounting that I talked about earlier very briefly. But that's an area that, that in emergencies, we've said, well, we need to approve the use of those surpluses for emergent things. The other thing is that there's, I would call it institutional contingency, not a huge amount of money, but if there's something that we really feel can't wait for the next budget cycle, then we may utilize that as well. And it varies. I'm not trying to be cryptic, but I would hesitate to say what that is at any one given time, basically.
Great. Thanks, Jake, and thanks, Keith, for the questions.
Yeah.
You started to talk a little bit about those carry forward funds. We had a question submitted earlier, and I think it fits better now in this conversation about carry forwards. There was a while there we weren't able to use them, and we were even told that we couldn't use them for gifts. And I think this is probably like in the first couple of years. Wondering where the university stands on that. I can't share full transparency, but Lori and I had a conversation with Daniel Durock, who are interim associate VP for budget. And for gifts, we've got a little more leniency there now. We just need to work with the budget office on those.
Right.
And there's still approvals that happen, but just your perspective.
Yeah. So my perspective is that Daniel's the expert on that, and we in the provost office support this kind of more evolution to be able to use those gifts. It makes sense if donors are giving gifts. It feels I don't know. It doesn't feel great to me to not be able to expend them. What I would contextually though share with you is that where I support Daniel also is that we have to be cautious as an institution, as everyone wanting to sort of use their carry forward all at once, because there is a cumulative impact basically. So sometimes what I think we're evolving to, Julie, would be really looking at the timing and kind of the priority as we move forward. But so I think there's much more of an openness than there was when we were kind of in a really significant financial constraints of a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. Still evolving, but I think you're going to find some flexibility as we move forward.
Great, thanks, Jake. And we got that same kind of feedback, I think, from Daniel, but we just have to be intentional and purposeful. It's not a free for all. So right. This does connect over. You talked in that, even in your answer there, about priorities, right? Yeah. And we had a couple of questions about priorities come through. One is a general one, like how are the university's budget priorities even determined? Yeah. So that's one. And then one more specifically, Kelly Bankert, thanks for the question, about the public commitments about racial equity and what that conversation may be looking like in overall budget discussions.
Yeah, so I think that, absolutely. I think that what we try to do is to think, what are our institutional priorities? What have we said our institutional priorities are? And then how are we matching that? So if you go on I think it's a Provost website, you can find the university's strategic priorities. And I think that we come back to those, and as mentioned in this presentation as well, to say, all right, is this something that we're going outside, or is this something within those? And they're very broad, I respect that, but still think that we really try to do that. And so when folks like you, Julie, come in and you give your presentation to when you have your strategy meeting, you and your team that did a great job of sort of laying out, this is where what we're advocating for as it relates to the university's priorities. So I think on that front, that's kind of the guiding, it's a framework for how we would go about that. I think on issues of racial diversity and social activism and ensuring that we're being aware, I think that comes, certainly is one of the priorities of the institution. I actually think that we need, and I'm looking in the mirror when I say this, not saying other people can do better at communicating what we have invested and what we want, what we've approved in terms of our investments in those areas, basically, as we go forward. And we are listening to advocates on an ongoing basis, in terms of what our priority needs, how those fit. And there are trade-offs. If we are investing in some areas, we have to make an institutional commitment that we may not invest in other areas as well. And again, not saying there's no value judgment in what I just said, simply that's part of what we do as we go forward.
Okay. I just want to check in, Kelly B, thanks again for the question. There's a second part to it about any racial equity goals being set using our economic power as an anchor institution in Evanston and Chicago. And that may be a more kind of a deeper component of what you just discussed. But Kelly Binkert, I just want to make sure, is there anything else that you want to add to that? Or is that an answer that we can follow up later?
Yeah, I mean, I would, well, while you're asking, I would just say, that is part of what we're talking about. I mean, I think, there are a number of things that we work through Dave Davis, through David Figlio, through other of our schools, as well as what we hope is contributing to a broader sort of impact, beyond our campus. And, again, on the specifics, I'd recommend following up. But I would actually recommend that you had a specific question about that, follow up directly with Dave Davis, who's our university community director of community relations or executive director of community relations. I'm not sure what his exact title is, but yeah, I would recommend that.
Neighborhood and community relations. Kelly B, I saw you unmute there for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's okay. You both did it at the same time. It happens.
No, it's fine. And Jake, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I think just to name that there are like 100 people on here. And so obviously this is a topic we're all very interested in. I think my question about the anchor institutions is really, we are a massive institution, obviously by size and by budget,
right,
in a community in Evanston and in Chicago. And many institutions of our size make very intentional commitments to think about our role as a permanent member of a community and what that looks like in terms of how we set goals around procurement from Black-owned businesses, local hiring agreements, things like that. In a coordinated, strategic way, in partnership with the community around some goals that are related to things like education equity and stuff like that. That's all connected together. So just curious what that conversation looks like. Yeah. There are some amazing professional organizations that support institutions in thinking about progress towards justice-oriented goals in using their economic resources.
Yeah, so it's a good point, and again, I think that there is the answer is that there is a conversation, and when you think about procurement, and you think about our facilities and our capital folks, and you think about, again, programmatically what we're doing with Chicago Public Schools and what we're doing here in Evanston, there are a wide range of those sorts of initiatives that are connected, if not fully evident to the community, as part of a very conscious idea of being impactful, both in Evanston and Chicago. I'm not trying to deflect, but I really sincerely would say that if you wanted to know more in more detail, I would just connect back to Dave Davis in terms of, because I think there's pretty significant detailed information about what we're doing in that space and what's planned in that space. And I'll come back to what I said before, and that is that you're asking this question, Kelly. I appreciate hearing it, because to me it says that we need to do better at communicating really some of the really neat things that we're doing to be that sort of anchor and that impact in both Chicago and in Evanston. So thank you. I appreciate the question.
All right. Well, it seemed to fly by to me. I don't know about you all. I mean, we have 3 minutes left, right? And so first off, Jake, if people could use your reaction buttons or whatever you want to do, just thanking Jake for being here with us today and putting the effort and labor in creating this presentation and sharing your expertise. We really appreciate you being here and teaching us all. I learned things today, and I've been here 9 years and have done budgets for a really long time. So thank you so much for that. Remember, this is step 1 in a series. And so next month, Lori Gordon, our own resident expert, will be talking about our student affairs budget. And then the month after that, I will do my best to really talk more about stewardship of the budget and how we tie things to that strategy that Jake talked about. So we'll talk about the strategy, and you'll have those basic building blocks, and we can talk to you about how we align these resources and get your questions answered that way. Okay. Don't forget, we do have a coffee chat next, yeah, it is next Wednesday. No, 2 weeks. I can do calendar math, I promise. 2 weeks, Wednesday, March 10th. So please just pop in if you're able. We'll have some good, fun conversation. It's a little more lighthearted. And still, we can answer some questions in that space too.
Great.
Also, again, recognizing Regan and Ronnie and Leslie Ann for their work in bringing this together. And then Anthony is here from Norris Tech Services. Thank you so much, Anthony, for making sure everything worked. The slides were working, the recording got started, and all of that labor behind the scenes. And then again, as a reminder, it's been recorded. Thank you, Jake, for letting us do that. And we'll also transcribe it into Spanish and put it on the website so that folks who couldn't be here have an opportunity to go back to it and watch it as well. And we will do that for our other 2 in the series too. So with that, again, Jake, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for being here, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. We'll see you.
All right.